This may sound like a weird question, but why does death smell so familiar? The first death I remember in our family was my mom's dad, my grandpa. I remember I would be his fishing buddy. We would go to the pond behind our house, or a pond behind a neighbor's house, or a pond that we didn't probably have permission to go to, but we went anyway because it's the middle of nowhere. And we would go and we would fish. And we would fish with cane poles, which are these long bamboo-style rods with hooks and line on the end. We put them out over the top, and within seconds, bluegill would be biting. And my grandpa would take them off the hook and put them in the 5-gallon bucket that he was sitting on. And without fail, whenever we'd be done, he'd stand up and his entire backside was soaking wet from the fish flipping up and down in the bucket because you can't sit on the other side or the water comes out. It's one of the only memories I remember of my grandpa. It's something that makes me laugh. But those types of memories that we have of people that we love, they don't last long enough, do they? They seem to be slipping away. And for my grandpa, it didn't take long for dementia to take over. And the grandpa that I knew was kind of different. He got angry at things that were familiar that became foreign. And that 5-gallon bucket was replaced by a hospital bed. And I was no longer his fishing buddy. I remember the day he passed in the home that he built with my grandma that's pictured there. And I remember tons of family and friends being over. And I remember thinking, why does death kind of smell so familiar? It was the house that I was raised in. It was the house that when my parents worked, my grandpa and my grandma watched me. I'd be dropped off in the morning. My grandma would make green eggs and ham in a blue bowl and read the story to me. It's a place where later in the day we would watch The Price is Right. She'd let me cheat at Scrabble because I didn't really know what I was doing. But I remember that day, my grandpa passing, I remember it smelling like bread baking. I remember it smelling like overwhelmingly bad Yankee candles. I remember the smell of mint and the mustiness throughout the house. It was familiar. My grandpa passed and we had a funeral, and that was the last time I saw him. Why is death so familiar? A nursing home, a hospital bed, a funeral home. None of us get to escape being acquainted with death. We know what it's like. We know what it feels like, what it sounds like. We are familiar with tears. We are familiar with pain. We understand the heartache and sorrow that comes with someone passing. We know what it's like to see hope give way to loss. We all have stories, encounters that we can share of our own stories of where we were hope-filled, but something took its place, and it feels like hope isn't quite there. We know what it's like to be left in spaces where hope feels absent. Yet even in those spaces, the spaces where hope seems absent, Jesus is in our midst. Jesus is in your midst. Jesus can be found in the space where it feels like our happy ending will never come. Jesus can be found in the midst when it feels like the entire universe just happens to be against us. When it feels like nothing good can come from what we're experiencing. When our car breaks down, when the baby won't sleep, when we get a bad diagnosis, or when we have a falling out with a family member. Even in those spaces, guess what? Jesus is present. And the question the first week of Advent is this: can hope spring up where hope has once been lost? Can hope spring up where hope has been lost? And in our gospel story, we are introduced to two different stories that are intertwined to where it looks like hope had been lost, but only Jesus is the one that can bring hope back. Our first character is Jairus, who's a synagogue leader in a small town. Jairus is the small town pastor. He knows everyone and everybody knows Jairus. He's done weddings and funerals. He's been in your homes. He knows everyone and everybody knows him. But his daughter is sick. Later in the text, his daughter is of 12 years, but we also find out that she dies. As Jesus is on the way there, she passes away. Don't worry, the story ends up a good story. But there's nothing that Jairus can do, but he heard that Jesus had come to town. Jairus is someone with everything to lose. His daughter is sick, is very sick, and there's nothing he can do. So he goes to Jesus. But maybe this Jesus can help, or maybe not. He's at the end of the rope, and there's no place for him to go. But the problem is, if Jairus goes to Jesus, what will people say? Jairus, you're the one that has a special connection to God. You're the one who oversees the preaching calendars, the schedules, the liturgies, the reading. Don't you have this connection? If you can't do anything, what makes you think Jesus is going to do anything? Jairus is someone who has everything to lose. This Sabbath, he's trying to find someone, but maybe next Sabbath he might be looking for a job. He might be looking for a new place of livelihood because he's doing something that probably shouldn't be done, trying to find Jesus. Jairus has everything to lose, yet he places his bet on Jesus. And he says this, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus goes with him. Jesus goes with the man, yet on the way we meet another character, an unnamed woman, a woman who, unlike Jairus, has nothing to lose because she's already lost everything. For 12 years, she has been sick. She's been bleeding. Bleeding, a sign of not sin, but impurity. Someone who needs cleansing before she can be in society. And for 12 years, she's not been able to be in community properly. But not just that, she's been hurting for 12 years. Verse 26 says, she has suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, things were just worse. For 12 years, she had been searching for answers, spending money she probably didn't have to find answers that seemingly didn't exist. And for 12 years, she's been tested. Let's put it into modern language, things that we might be able to relate with. She's had blood tests, bone marrow samples, experimental drugs with high promises yet high risk, biopsies, colonoscopies, painful pelvic exams, pokes, stress tests, psych exams, drinking different dyes for different images that made her sick, getting her personal experience of what's happening in her body discredited and being passed off from doctor to doctor to doctor. She has no answers. Now, 12 years later, she's broke. And things are much worse. She comes to Jesus for the same reason. Maybe, just maybe, Jesus can do something. And she pushes in on Jesus in hopes of touching him. If I just touch his clothes, maybe I'll be healed. When I was reading this story, we identify with this. My wife has been dealing with something since before we were dating. She has an autoimmune disorder that causes her pain, that causes her exhaustion. And she's been passed on from doctor to doctor. She's gone to Mayo. She's had tests and prodding and pokes. She's had her personal experience discredited. And it's been very difficult for us. So when I read this story, I go, yeah. And we've been in desperate places. I remember when I was pastoring in Nebraska and my wife was still here in Illinois before we were married, we were engaged. And we're on the phone, we're talking. And I find out that in a local church not too far from where I was pastoring, there was like this special healing pastor man dude that happened to just have some sort of special anointing that I didn't have. And I was desperate hearing what she was going through. And so I went to the service and there's people standing up being slain in the spirit. And I'm like, maybe something's wrong with me. Maybe God's not answering my prayer because I just don't have what he has. And I remember out of desperation going up to him and be like, hey, my fiance's not doing great. She's dealing with this thing. No one can figure it out. Could you pray for her? Because apparently you have something that I don't. What do you do when something is off in your body, but no one listens? What do you do when you pray, but it feels like God doesn't quite answer your prayer? For many of us, the journey kind of ends there. For many of us, we give up. For some of us, we keep searching, hoping and leaning that God really is good. Maybe you've been there in a place of searching, or maybe you are there right now, and you're searching, wondering, God, are you really as good as you say you are, as they say you are? Because I don't seem to be experiencing that today. We have Jairus, a man with everything to lose, and an unnamed woman who has nothing left to lose. Which one are you? Have you found yourself in the space of hopelessness with everything to lose, friends, family, your job, your community, spaces that were once full of life now seem to be slipping away. It's a story of a mom who got divorced. And in divorces, we totally forget that, guess what? Friends pick sides. And now this mom is in community without her friends, and she's wondering if maybe she should have just stayed in that toxic relationship. It's a story of a student who has changed and now is going back to youth group, and they don't quite fit in anymore. Their friends at youth group are not accepting of them. They don't understand who they are anymore, and so they step away from community. It's a story of a family who's lost a child, and the grief is overwhelming. And in the spaces that you thought were safe, now people are just saying, you can just get over it. You have 2 other kids. And it hurts. Are you someone in a space where you feel like you have lost everything? Do you identify with Jairus? Do you long for this? Jesus, just put your hands on me. And if you do, everything will be okay, and I think I will live. Or have you already lost everything? Is it impossible for you to see Jesus in your midst? Does it feel like God is absent? Does it feel like you are wandering in the desert and you are not sure which direction to go? You show up week after week because that is what you're supposed to do. It's a story of a parent that's disconnected from their child. Maybe even a grandparent disconnected from their grandkids. They've walked away from the faith, there was a skirmish, something happened, and now the grandkids are collateral. It's the story of someone who has lost their faith. They come to church week after week hoping that something will reignite it, but you're just here out of duty. And you haven't really felt God, or you haven't really talked to God. You've just come because this is what you are supposed to do. Or maybe it is the story of someone who's gone to the doctors again and again and again, and you have no answers. How can the weary world rejoice when the weariness is so overwhelming? Today is the first Sunday of Advent, a journey of waiting, of expectation, a season of longing, of wanting Christ to break in and to come and to make all things new. I long for Jesus. I long for a world to be much different than what it is, and I long for the pain that I'm familiar with to be different. And today, there are those who have everything to lose, and those who have lost everything. And the response from Jesus is the same. Jesus sees you. Jesus wants to touch your life, and Jesus wants to bring new life. With Jesus, hope can spring up once again in the places where hope has been lost. Now, not every story has a resolution, but our story has a high point. A couple months ago, Barbara went back to the doctor, and a doctor finally started listening to her, started searching and seeing kind of what is going on, and noticed a trend in her labs. Barbara has low iron. Not only does she have low iron, her body doesn't really absorb iron. And so she needed to get a transfusion of iron. So insurance, don't worry, I talked to her before I shared any of this. That'd be bad. That's a pastor no-no. Or a husband no-no. Sleep on the couch. No, it's been approved. But she got the infusion, and things are different. We don't know if this is a fix. We don't know if this is temporary. But for the first time in like 15 years, she's not getting tired going up the stairs. She's not getting tired putting our kids to bed at night. She's not exhausted as she's walking up and down the ICU floor at Edwards, doing her best to be present for patients and family. For the first time, Barbara was seen, she was heard, and her life was touched. And it feels like in our household, hope has been rekindled. In this story, these stories, healing does come from faith. But healing comes when both the young girl and the woman are seen and heard, and when they are touched. The truth is, hope can spring up in places where hope has been lost. And this is what Advent is all about. Hope can abound once again, and healing can come. Lives can be restored. Jesus has decided to move into my and into your neighborhood. Jesus has chosen forever you and me. Jesus has seen us, has heard us, and Jesus chooses to touch our lives. Every part of our lives. A dead girl and a woman bleeding. Jesus crosses the boundaries. Jesus goes where there is pain. Jesus goes where he's not really supposed to go, death and blood, messy, unclean, impure. Jesus, you really shouldn't be there. There's better, more clean, more sterile places for you to show up. And sometimes I think we are the ones who Jesus shouldn't be wasting his time on. I think sometimes we think that we're the ones that Jesus really shouldn't be wasting his time on. I used to think Jesus was too busy to be bothered with what I was going through. Because if I look to my left and I look to my right, guess what? There's someone that has it much, much worse than I do. So Jesus, you can't be bothered with me because you've got a lot of other bigger fish on the scene. And maybe it's just best that I suffer in silence. And I know I'm not alone. There are many of us that do that. Week after week, you go through pain. Week after week, you go through frustrating circumstances. And you weather it alone. And you sit there in these pews in silence. All because we don't want to bother people. And we don't want to bother Jesus. I think the church is full of silent sufferers, simply bearing life's burdens alone. Can I let you in on a little secret here? I think Jesus wants to be bothered. And I think it's okay to bother Jesus. I love that these stories are intertwined. 12 years of suffering meets a life that is ending at just 12 years of age. But there's different. There's a woman who's desperate for change, and she takes it on her own hands to go after Jesus. She leans and wades her way through the crowd to get to Jesus. She simply touches his robe, and it changes everything. She has no one but herself. She has no advocate. And then there's a dad who knows his daughter can't do anything for herself. So he puts his livelihood on the line and goes and finds Jesus. There are some times where we need others to help bring us to Jesus. And there are times where we really need to make the decision to make a move towards Jesus ourselves. And I think our lives oscillate between these two postures. There are times we need to be advocates of others, and there are times when you and I need to drop everything and we need to just go to Jesus ourselves. A dead girl lives, a woman bleeding is now whole, all because of Jesus. Jesus is the reason why the weary world can rejoice. Jesus is the one who sees us, who hears us, and is the one who can bring healing and touch our lives. And we're going to do something a little different. Pastor Greg and I are going to do an anointing. There's nothing magical in this, but this is a sacramental practice. This is a reminder that God sees us and that we aren't alone. And throughout church history, anointing has been used for healing of bodies, of mind, soul, spirit, of uniting communities. So that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to start our journey of Advent, of longing, of expectation, of coming to the Christ child who makes all things new by coming together as a community, if you want to, and being anointed. Deborah's going to be playing something, and as you feel led, Pastor Greg and I would love to anoint you. You don't have to tell us what's going on, but you might have one of those two postures. You have nothing to lose, or maybe you're in a place where you have everything to lose. Maybe you're someone that has to drop everything you have and come to Jesus. Or maybe you're sitting next to someone that you need to bring them to Jesus yourself. No pressure. We're not going to make it weird. But if you would like to be anointed, we're going to have music play, and then we'll do our hymn. But Christ is for you. And Advent is all about reversals. Places that were void of hope can be hope-filled again. So come as you feel that.
Thank you for listening to the Encounter Faith podcast. This podcast is a service of G. Shep Productions from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Naperville, Illinois. All rights reserved. If you're in the area, we'd love to meet you on a Sunday morning at our 9 a.m. or 10:45 services. At Good Shepherd, we are inviting everyone to walk together in the calling of Christ for a life of eternal impact. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Ross Cochran, and our theme song is Wake the Earth by 1111 Worship. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again soon.